I will take this off as we are social distancing very safely here in the room. This is certainly an unusual and different time. These presentations are all a part of that. I would also add that if you have questions out there, at any point, if you feel like asking it, go ahead. Tony, if anybody asks one while we're doing this, we don't have to necessarily wait until the end. I'll kind of bounce around as needed. Thank you all for having me here. It's an honor to be here at the Max. The space is beautiful. It's my first time here, and I got to tour the facilities earlier, and it's absolutely, it's amazing. It's a wonderful celebration of the art and creativity that our state has given to the world, and it's quite humbling and an honor to be here and be a part of it. Thank you to the Halsey Institute for the original curation of this show that is now, I guess, about halfway through its run. It's got a couple of more stops after it leaves here in Meridian, and it's quite an honor to be a part of that exhibit as well. It's a pretty amazing exhibit, so I do recommend if you have time out there and you are in the Meridian area, certainly stop by. I'm told that it's also at the Meridian Museum of Art as well. It's such a large exhibit that it spills across both the Max and the Meridian Museum of Art. So I am here today to talk a bit about my work. The photographs that I have in the exhibit are photographs from this project that I did at Pole Monkeys. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge a couple of things right off the bat. The first is that I am a white man, and I am about to talk a lot about African American culture in Mississippi. And that I'm extremely proud of the work that I've done. I think it's important. I think it's needed. But I also think it's problematic that much of the photographic history of our state was performed by people that are just like me, that look like me, that are white, that are men. And we need more photographers and storytellers of color in Mississippi. And I think that it's also important for us to recognize that being an artist, being a creative, is not a field that pays a lot of money. And as such, it's harder and harder and harder for someone to dedicate their life to that pursuit. And that means that we are headed in a direction where only those that are able to dedicate 100% of their time to the pursuit of understanding and art and creativity are going to be those that have the means to do so, that have the privilege to do so. And that is also problematic, and that is something that we need to be very attentive to in the world in which we live, because our artists and our historians and those and our creatives and all of the people who take their time to try to understand what it means for all of us to live in this cultural gumbo that is the world, not just this country, is really vital. And so we need to make a point to be able to not only educate, but to also empower and to create an economic base so that those creatives can continue to work. I'm very proud to work for the Mississippi Delta National Heritage Area, which is managed through the Delta Center of Cultural Learning at Delta State University. That is the mission of both of those organizations. We do a lot of work in the Mississippi Delta, where we help create cultural understanding, not by defining it ourselves, but by helping to empower and create opportunities for those that live in the Delta, that make it their home, to be able to tell the stories from their own voices. And so I think that that's a really vital thing for us all to be attentive to as we go through this. So, Pole Monkeys. I'll give you a brief history. I also want to acknowledge Boyce Upholt, who wrote this beautiful essay for the book. I'm going to be reading some of his words today. Boyce, if you happen to be out there watching right now, thank you. I was reading back over everything again last night, and I am very much humbled by your words and your ability as a writer. If you are not familiar with Boyce out there, pay attention to him. He is a tremendous writer doing important work in our region. Lived in the Mississippi Delta for years. He came down as a member of Teach for America, and he now makes his home in New Orleans, another one of our wonderful creative city. Technically not in Mississippi, but a lot of our creatives in the state of Mississippi like to spend a lot of time down there. So I'll be reading some of his words today as well. So, Pole Monkeys. I became interested in Pole Monkeys as a documentary project sometime around 2007, 2008 or so. And I'll go through some of that process as I give this lecture today. What you see on the screen now is actually Rabbit Seabury. He worked for the Hyder family on their farms for years, and it was his son Willie that ultimately became very well known for Po' Monkey's Juke Joint. All of the children in the Seabury family had animal nicknames. Rabbit was the father. There's Teddy. There was Monkey, who was Willie and gave himself the name Po' Monkey. And so I was relatively early on in my career as a photographer, still trying to figure out what it meant to be a photographer, what I wanted to do as a photographer. I had these grand ideas when I first came back home in the late 90s that I was going to need to travel the world, that I was going to have to be everywhere but my home in order to actually be a quote-unquote real photographer. But I decided to open a studio after completing my studies, or all the coursework at the University of Mississippi in journalism school. The thesis is still outstanding. I think that's important to actually state publicly because some of my bio says it incorrectly. I have not graduated with a journalism degree. I have everything left but the thesis, and this project is actually intended to be my thesis. I did just complete an MFA at the Maine College of Art, and that journalism degree is next up. So I'd come back home after graduate school, decided that I wanted to be a photographer. I was mostly curious about these worlds that lived beneath the worlds. When I was in graduate school at the University of Mississippi and discovered still photography, what I mostly became enamored with was not the craft of photography, but the way it seemed to be this golden ticket to these other worlds that existed right at the same time as the one on the surface that we all seem to participate in. And I began to realize, sometimes consciously, but mostly subconsciously at that point, that there was more going on than I realized in the world around me. And by being a young photographer and being on campus at that point and having access to photograph the football games from the field, or to be at lectures and be in the green room with the academics or the politicians or the actors or the musicians or the artists or whoever it was that was lecturing that day, to be in the room with them before they went on the stage to perform and hear those conversations and hear how they were preparing for all of those things was fascinating to me. And I realized that we only see a very small version of what we assume to be real. And that's what I fell in love with. And I didn't quite know why that was or what the point of all of it was. I just knew that there was something about that was truer than this surface world. And so I was bouncing around some ideas with a regional magazine that's based there in Cleveland about doing projects. And we ultimately decided to do something at Po' Monkeys. And they gave me about 9 months to work on this project. And so I began to go out to Po' Monkeys to photograph it consciously. I'd been there one time when I was 21, 22 years old in the early 90s in college. That was more to drink beer and hang out at a place that seemed risque, that seemed dangerous, that seemed like I wasn't supposed to be there. But I didn't do it back then with the intention of having any type of intellectual engagement with the space at all. But when I went back around 2008 to start doing this work for the magazine, that became part of the point. By that point, I was very curious about why so many people from all over the world were coming down to the Delta regularly. I'd had the good fortune of being asked by the governor of Mississippi to be an original member of the Blues Commission. Unfortunately, I was a political casualty as that progressed, and so I didn't make it longer than about 6 or 9 months on that commission. But I was there very early for those conversations about how we would shape this cultural magic that was produced in the state of Mississippi and turn it into something that would have an economy. That began to be part of what I was curious about when I was viewing and documenting Po monkeys. And so for those 9 months, I did the work out there, turned it in, and it ultimately was published. And I felt like an imposter still, even though the work got some praise and a lot of people said they enjoyed it. It still didn't feel real. Felt like I'd not really done anything other than publish some pictures as an outsider gazing at something that I began to increasingly feel like I didn't have the right to gaze at in that manner. And so rather than stop and run from it, I decided to keep going and see what more I could learn from it. And I'll just share a few photographs of Willie over the years. I'm really proud of the portraits that I've made of Willie over the years. I regret that I don't have more. I didn't have more time. I think like most people, I assumed I'd have a lot more time, that I'd still be documenting Willie now. And so I began to watch Willie as he engaged with the world, and I did interviews with him, and I've got oral histories, and I've got video and recordings with him, and lots of photographs. This project consists of about 23,000 photographs that are on my hard drives. It's primarily a digital project, but I do have some film that I shot there as well. But I began to notice that Willie would interact almost the same way every single time with anyone that asked him questions. He would tell me the same answers if I asked him questions. He would tell other interviewers the same answers. I'd see him on Anthony Bourdain, and I could tell you before Anthony even asked him a question what Willie was about to tell Anthony, because he had a way of responding to all of the questions that came his way. He knew how to tell you what he thought you wanted to hear. Made his life easier. And it also helped the patrons keep coming. It kept the world coming to Po monkeys. And so I'll pause here for a second, and I'm going to read some of Boyce's words about it. After Willie passed away in 2016, Boyce and I spent a lot of time together. I needed to take a break from the project, primarily to just kick all these things around in my head. And I'll talk a little bit later about the impact of Willie's death on July 14th, 2016, and what that meant for my understanding of this work that I'd been doing for 8 or 9 years at that point. But I began to talk to Boyce. Boyce is a wonderful journalist, and he took a lot of my notes. I felt like there wasn't much more that I could do. I just needed a break from it, so I handed a lot of it over to Boyce for him to pick up the baton and go do some of the work and add to it. And that's something that I'm also really proud of, and I wish I'd collaborated with even more people, and that's what I enjoy about my job now, is that the work is primarily collaborative between me and a whole slew of people, and it's their projects that they're working on, and my job is not to tell them how to do it or what to do. It's to help them do it in the best way that they can, help them find resources. And I think that's the best way for any of us to understand any culture, is to have as many stories about that culture coming from as many different directions as we possibly can. In particular, the people that are born into that culture are the most important storytellers of it. And as I said earlier, that's something that we need significantly more of, particularly here in Mississippi. As we move forward as a state, we continue to celebrate our culture. This space is one of those spaces that does that. We have a myriad of them popping up all over the state. Just in the Mississippi Delta alone, we have over 40 museums right now, all interpreting culture in some way. The majority of them are actually run and founded by people of color, and I think that's something really significant, and I hope that it will continue to grow. So my understanding and the world's understanding of how Po monkeys got started is that Willie started the juke joint sometime in the 60s. That Willie was a bachelor all of his life, and that he started the juke joint. After he passed away, Eula Mae Drake became a part of the story, as she was legally declared to be Willie's wife. And in hindsight now, knowing what I know posthumously after he passed away, combined with some of the information that he shared with me, I do believe they were married, and I believe they were failed by the system, that their paperwork was either filed incorrectly or not filed at all, because they would have been married in the early 60s. They would have both been from tenant farming families. And the clerks in Bolivar County at the time probably assumed that their paperwork would never really amount to much of anything, and so it wasn't worth keeping track of significantly enough, except for the fact that Willie made it significant with his juke joint. And he, through this story, is an example of the flaws of our system. Were it not for Po Monkey's Lounge, we wouldn't have this extreme example of the problematic issue of paperwork. Something as simple as paperwork. So Boyce interviewed Eula May, and these are his words about that interview. When Willie was a boy, a place like Po Monkey's would not have been so unusual. There were many more shacks and houses back then, lining the dirt roads that crisscrossed every cotton plantation. Houses was all around, as Eula May tells me. These houses, I sometimes think, were the raw heart of the Mississippi Delta. They sheltered men and women, farm workers mostly, who in generations prior had stoked and midwifed the famous Delta blues. They all gone now, Eula May says, the houses and the workers both. We are sitting in the office of her nephew, a lawyer in Vicksburg, Mississippi, sweating in the late summer heat. For months, I've been nervously trying to get in touch with Eula May. This is again Boyce talking. Through her lawyer, through family friends, through anyone that might know her. I'm sure she doesn't want to walk back through this story. But now that I've reached her, I find she is happy to chat. Willie couldn't read or write, she tells me. So when people asked about her or her family, he couldn't go back and tell them. So he left all that out, like it never happened. Now she gets to set the record straight. She begins with fond memories. Those who knew Willie in his final years at the juke joint, when he was a famous talker, a man with so many antics, already have a decent picture of the younger man, she says. He was always friendly. He always talked a lot. He had all kinds of women running after him. But Willie ran after her, or at least that's the story that Eula May tells. And I'll sidetrack here a bit, break from Boyce's text for a second to say that in my interviews with Willie, I can corroborate that. And in hindsight now, recognizing the pieces in a different context than they were told to me at the time, or that I understood them at the time, I can see where I think Willie did love Eula May very, very, very much. But he also loved being Willie very, very, very much. And those two things were at conflict. And Eula May said, no, this is how it will be, or it won't. So I'll continue with Boyce's writing. But Willie ran after her, or at least that's the story Eula May tells. When my mother and father go out to do the shopping, here he comes, as soon as they leave. He'll watch for the car to leave, and he'll run over. Her siblings told their parents about the young suitor. It didn't make no difference. Here he come anyway. She was 13, which would make Willie 17. When Eula May was nearly 14, he started calling more formally. My mom used to let him sit here until about 9 o'clock at night, and then he had to go and get up. Her mother would tell stories to the young boy and feed him. He was more like a child of the house, Eula May says. He asked my mom to start taking me out to the movies, and he made a promise with her. If I get pregnant, he'd marry me. So in 1960, the young couple went to a reverend. Willie was 20 years old. Eula May was just 16. Willie liked to party then as much as he did at the end of his life. He would go out on the weekends, drinking with friends. Eula May was scared to stay at the house alone. She would have gone and stayed at her parents' house, but they ran a juke joint, and Willie didn't want her there. So I said, well, how can I solve this problem? It's to open a juke joint myself. She hoped it might keep Willie at the house. Willie was against the idea, but Eula May persisted. I called the man from Cleveland, Mississippi, had him bring the jukebox in and set it up there. So when Willie came home, it was there. And that's exactly how it got started. And that was 1961. Eula May says she cooked. Hamburgers were 25 cents, hot dogs were 10. and ran gambling tables on the weekends, craps and cards. There was a similar joint on every corner, and the police left them all alone. The juke joints had to protect themselves. Eula May tells me about a patron named Thibault who would get drunk and start fights and then leave to go get his gun. Eula May would have to close the club and wait out front with her brother, a sawed-off shotgun ready to turn Thibault away. The toughest trouble, though, might have been Willie himself. Eula May kept her earnings stuffed in her bra, and one day he snatched it. He wanted to know what I done made, she says. She told him that if he stayed home on weekends, he'd know. We was on the floor, she remembers, grabbing money and grabbing money. And after that, she began to bury cash in the yard. It got bad enough, she says, that she thought about killing Willie with the sawed-off shotgun. Instead, in 1965, after 5 years of marriage, she moved away. Willie followed her to Chicago, but he eventually came back to see another woman he'd been dating, Eula May says. They never lived together again. But we never lost no friendship, she adds. I mean, that was the best friendship I ever had. She says that whenever she came to visit Bolivar County, even in the final years, she would stay at that famous house. That's Eula May's version. Willie sometimes told people she was crazy and that she was always chasing after him, trying to win him back, but Willie also liked to tell stories or to tell listeners what they wanted to hear. One of Po Monkey's closest friends did tell me that he'd met Eula May once or twice and that she was sweet and that Willie was happy to see her, laughing, hugging, kissing her on the cheek. And I'll take a break there for a second and also corroborate that. The same friend told me the same thing. I ran into him at a convenience store just a few weeks after Willie's funeral. And that was one of the first meetings when a lot of this project began to change for me. Because Willie had a persona that his friends helped him hold on to. There were very few people that actually knew the real Willie Seabury, but there were a lot of people that felt like they knew the real Willie Seabury. And he was very adept and talented at doing that. After he passed away, some of his friends began to tell me more stories, and Boyce as well, some of them around Eula May, about Willie's travels. I always wondered where he would go on the weekends, what he did with all that money. We'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. And I think that he probably spent more time in Vicksburg than most people realized, and that there was a complicated relationship between him and Eula May, as many of us often have complicated relationships with people that we care about but for whatever reason just can't live with. And that was part of the relationship with Willie and Eula May. Sometime after Willie, this is back to Boyce's words again, sometime after Willie came home from Chicago, he opened his own club. Willie would often tell people the year was 1963. That conflicts with Eula May's timeline, of course. But Willie wasn't known for his precision. Again, if we go back to Eula May's timeline, she would have opened the club in 1961. They were married for 5 years, so it would have been sometime after 1966 that Willie came home. There are a lot of discrepancies in the timeline, not just with Willie, but if you look at blues history as a whole, there are all kinds of small little gaps that we have to make. And I'm sitting in a room with historians now, and if you guys have done any work with blues historian, there are often gaps in the paperwork, and there are pieces that you have to put together, but there are still sometimes assumptions. You try to bring those things as closely together as you can, but there still are assumptions that have to be made often, and that is because of the examples of paperwork not being kept up for the blues musicians, for the tenant farmers, for people like Willie Seabury and Eula May Drake. Willie would often tell people the year was 1963. That conflicts with Eula May's timeline, of course, but Willie wasn't known for his precision. Sometimes he'd give no number. I don't know exactly to a T, he told the New York Times when a reporter asked when he'd opened the club, maybe 40 or 50 years ago. He was very smart with his language about not getting pinned down to specifics, but sounding really specific. Everyone in his family had an animal nickname. There was a rabbit, a coon, a bear. Willie had said the Poe was given to him, but it seems more likely it was his own invention, which I also agree with. It is reflective of his particular genius, self-pitying and self-confident all at once. Eula May told me that he'd repeat the name as kind of a mantra. Po Monkey gonna make it, he'd say, over and over again. Po Monkey gonna make it for sure. Eventually, of course, he did. There's little record of the club in its first days. It was a casual place off the books. I'll stop there. No, I'll keep going. But a man named Larry Grimes. Larry's actually in this museum. I was really happy when I toured it earlier to see that you've got a big exhibit of Larry. Larry was a great friend of mine, gave me many gifts of his art over the years. I'd show up at Monkeys and Larry would have a sculpture for me out front. He got to sign a few books with me in the fall and passed away not long after that. I miss him and Willie greatly. So Larry tells Boyce that he remembers driving past in 1973. He was searching for junk, just anything old, a bathtub maybe, or a wash pot, a tea kettle. Larry liked to make sculptures from junk. Ain't nothing here for sale, he remembers Willie saying. But then Willie added that the place was a juke joint and that Larry should come back. A few months later, Larry did just that. He kept on coming for years. Blues does something to you, he told me all these years later. They make your heart open up. Larry is white. He's what they used to call here in the Delta a poor white, the sixth of 11 children, turned down by the Army because I didn't have no education, he says. But then later, they drafted him anyway, sent him to Vietnam. And he now lives in an unkempt trailer or house that's surrounded by his cobbled-together sculptures. The fact that a poor white was hanging out at a juke joint in the mid-'70s says something about both Larry and the joint, and about Willie too. Decades later, when Po Monkeys would become famous among blues fans across the world, it was just for this openness. Po Monkeys was the party anyone could attend. So for years, Po Monkeys was, by all accounts, unique in its patronage and who came and went from the doors, as witnessed by Larry, but also by all of the farmers and mostly the farmers' sons that worked alongside Willie. Park Hyder, who owns the farm now, inherited it from his father. Willie worked alongside Park when Park was a teenager, and then ultimately Park became the owner of the farm and became Willie's boss. But Po Monkeys began to reach prominence worldwide probably in the late 90s. Bernie Imes, who has been a great mentor and influence of my work, published a book in the 90s entitled Juke Joint. Many of you have probably seen it, particularly if you're from Mississippi. Some of his work, Bernie's also in this museum. His work was primarily of these spaces. It's about vernacular architecture mostly. There are people in the photographs, but it's mostly about the structures and the buildings themselves. So from an artistic standpoint, that was one of the things that I wanted to try and differentiate myself from in Bernie's work. I felt like because I was photographing Po Monkeys, one, I wanted to be very, very specific about a space and not try to be too broad and give an overview of all juke joints. And then I also wanted the work to be black and white because I didn't want you to be seduced by the space. I wanted you to pay attention to the people. I'm a believer that no space has meaning without the people that inject it there. And that as we think about preserving spaces, we also, more importantly, have to think about the people that gave it life. Willie gave Po Monkeys its life, as well as all the patrons that visited. Also in the late 90s, Annie Leibovitz published a book called American Music. It's a pretty thorough, pretty large volume of work that is all about American music. Lots of jazz, lots of blues. The first third of the book is about blues. This was published when Annie was at the height of her Vanity Fair career. And this photograph here was used often to promote the project when it was out. This is Po Monkeys sometime in the early 90s. I'll show you a picture here in the next slide of a photograph that I made. And you'll notice in this photograph, the sky is clean. There's nothing there. And then the next photograph I'll show you, there's a tree that's behind it, and I always lamented that that tree had grown up by the time I began to document it, and I could never get a clean photograph of Poe monkeys like this. You'll also see that the porch is still open. That porch was enclosed some years later. You'll see it in the photographs that I show you. It was still there, but it was enclosed, and the stairs were moved to the front. There's still a remnant of the stairs on the side, but all of this was enclosed mainly for storage of DJ equipment. And then also in conjunction with this, the internet began to grow and began to be a thing. And Delta State created the Delta Center for Culture and Learning. Luther Brown was its first director. Luther came down from the north and helped to get the Blues Trail off the ground, was very instrumental in founding the first Blues Commission, which I mentioned earlier. But he also helped those of us that live in the Delta recognize the importance of the culture that was all around us that we'd taken for granted for years. And that began the relationship of the university. Luther began to have academics around Poe monkeys and would take groups out there to visit. And so all of those things came together, and around the year 2000, Poe monkeys began to explode. That was also around the time that Clarksdale began to have a very focused effort on creating blues tourism in their community as well. And so we now, as a state, have the privilege of 20 years of trying to build this that we can look back on and see what we've done well, but also what we can do better. And there are always things that you can do better, always things that you can do better. But that doesn't mean that we've not done anything well at all. And so for years, here's my photograph that I made. It's one of the few color photographs that I'll show of Poe monkeys, but you can see that giant tree right behind it and how quickly that grew up over the course of about 15 years from the time that Annie Leibovitz made her photograph to the time I made mine, maybe 15 or 20 years. And so when I first started going out there, I would kind of sit against the wall. I would try to be, I used the philosophy of a fly on the wall, and I didn't want anybody to really know I was there. And what I began to realize is that was not the right approach to take. And it all switched for me in one instance. I showed up one night with this photograph framed very large. I wanted to take Willie a photograph. I'd narrowed it down to two. One was a portrait of him in his bedroom, which I showed earlier. It was this one, which to my knowledge is the only portrait ever made in his bedroom, which was right off of the bar. And the other was this color photograph. And I was worried that if I'd show him the portrait of him in the bedroom that he might put the kibosh on the whole project. And so I went the safe route and I took this photograph in and I printed it about 20 by 30 and I walk into the space. And as soon as I go into the door, I immediately notice about 5 or 10 other 20 by 30 large color portraits of the exterior Poe monkeys. And I also noticed one of my photographic heroes, a gentleman that is a member of Magnum. And Magnum is kind of the agency. Cartier-Bresson was a founder of Magnum, and so this photographer was sitting right there. And I was, whoa, what's this guy doing here? And here I am with this very plain photograph that is all over this structure. And so I tucked the photograph away. I think a farmer has it now somewhere. Willie was also very good. If you ever took him a piece of art or a photograph or anything like that, particularly one that was framed, 90% odds that it wound up at somebody else's house. He gave them away constantly. And this one too, no telling who has this photograph. If you're out there on Facebook and you happen to be the one that has this photograph that I printed for Willie, I don't want it back. I just would love to know who has it. So if any of you know, let's go on a great Facebook hunt and see if we can figure it out. So I go over and I talk to this photographer. And it's a very brief conversation, 3 to 5 minutes tops. And I just ask him, what brings you here? What brings you to the Delta? And he tells me that he'd been teaching a workshop in Clarksdale. And then he adds, and I will never forget this. And I'm not quite sure why he added it, I have some suspicions, I have some suspicions, I'll leave it there. But he looks at me and he says, "Oh, I love this place. I come here all the time. I've been here probably 2 or 3 times in the last 4 years." And I thought to myself, I've been here 2 or 3 times in the last 3 days. Po' Monkeys was primarily open on Thursday nights. There was a period of Monday nights where it was open as well, but pretty much it was Thursday nights, unless somebody had rented it out for another night. But I would often go out there, I'd take a lunch break, I'd make a sandwich, I'd go sit in the trees across the way and just see who would pass. It's very peaceful, right across the gravel road from the house, from Po' Monkeys, is this beautiful wooded area, and when it's dry, you can back your car in there. And so I would go eat sandwiches. And what I realized is that I had something that this photographer would never have. This man with a resume 1,000,000 times better than mine will probably ever be, and with credibility in ways that I'll never have. But I had access. I could go out there every day if I wanted to. I grew up in this area, and that allowed me relationships that he would never have. And so from that day forward, I realized that if I just keep going back and I decide to learn something new about this home, this thing that I was always interested in about photography in the first place, recognize that there's a world that I know nothing about, and it's right here parallel to the world that I grew up in, that I would come up with something interesting in the work. This is Willie's birth certificate, just to give you an idea of paperwork. It was issued in 2012. That's when he got his first birth certificate, in 2012. Up to that point, he'd never needed one. He got it for a couple of reasons. In the book, Boyce mentions that he needs a driver's license, but I'd also been told that he needed it for Social Security. 2012, this man got his first birth certificate, and it took a year. It took a year of interviews and people being grilled about, how do you know when Willie was born? When was Willie born? Where was he born? All kinds of people being asked these questions, and the courts ultimately determining his birth date as August 24th, 1940. But no one can say with certainty that that was the date. That's the date that it was declared would be his birthday. And so, as I continued to work on this, particularly after Willie passed away, and also in my studies with the Master of Fine Arts, I began to recognize that even though my work was documentary and that I was raised or trained in the field of journalism and this idea of being separate from the story and just being a witness, being the fly on the wall, that that's impossible, that every act of making a photograph is an act of creation, and every act of creation occurs specifically from the standpoint of the maker. And I think that's really important for all of us to pay attention to as we engage with any photographs, because photographs over the years have been the most effective tool at convincing us that our reality is not actually our reality. It's the most manipulative form of creation that we have in that way. As you go through this exhibit at Southbound, keep in mind that every single photograph that you see was made by a person, and every one of those individuals brought into that photograph their entire experience of life. And they chose to make that photograph in that way for that reason. They may not know why that happened. Some are more conscious of that than others. But every one of them was made through the lens of that individual. And as such, the truth is really only through the experience of that individual, nothing more than that. That's not to say that there can't be meaning or truth that is extracted from it in another way, but it starts with the creator, not with the subject. Photographs are often mistaken for the subject being the most important thing. Tony, you mentioned WPA a little bit earlier. So there's some of this. Here's an example of where some of that lives. So this is a photograph that Walker Evans made as part of the WPA and the FSA work that was done, particularly in the South. And this is a Mississippi field in 1936. Juxtaposition that with a photograph that I made in 2012, which is not that much different, except for the fact that Walker's was made in daylight, mine was made in dark. Why are those things? As you look at photographs, those are things to keep in mind. Why did one photographer photograph this in full light and the other one in predominant shadow? Elements such as notes on the wall give you a juxtaposition of the differences of who would even visit. This is one note. These lined the walls everywhere. And here's another. I began to recognize that I needed to engage more with the patrons, the people that were visiting Po' Monkeys, that I needed to have more conversations with them, and that would help me understand more and learn more about why they went and all of these things that were still rattling around in my brain as to why does this matter so much to me. And so I decided that I had a friend from Austin that's a filmmaker, and we were going to shoot some video things just to try something different. And I also learned through this project that when you hit the first wall and you feel like you're repeating yourself, you're not done. You've just hit your first wall. You don't get to a good project until you keep banging your head through wall after wall after wall. And one of the things that I chose to do was to change my technique and how I would do that. So I knew that I wanted to visit with people more. And so I began to think of ways that I could do that. One of the first things was, I've got to move outside the club. It's too loud in here. I can't have a conversation when we are inside. So we moved outside the club. I began to think of, well, how can I do visuals? And so I thought of Richard Avedon and his American West project, where he just used a white backdrop. This is what's going on in this photograph. We see a wide shot of Avedon at work as he's preparing for a photograph. The resulting photographs look like this, so that there wasn't a whole lot of distracting background and all you saw were the subjects. And so I began to think about that, and I said, well, I'll try an Avedon technique. Let me take a white backdrop out there. And that's where these series of photographs that are in the book, and I think there's a few that are in the exhibition as well, came from. That was a decision, like many others in creativity. There's usually not anything new from an individual technique that happens in any art. Art is really about taking known things and putting them together in different ways so that you come up with a different solution. It's all just problem solving, using whatever information you happen to have in your brain or at your disposal at that time. And so I went straight back to work that I was familiar with and said, what can I do with Avedon? This was the very first photograph that I made as a light check, but what I realized very quickly on is that something was going to happen in that wide shot area that would be interesting in these photographs. And rather than shoot tightly like Avedon did, because I began to recognize that there was a tension that seemed to be happening there between between tourism and home. There was always, one of the things that was very unique about Po' Monkeys over a lot of our blues tourism sites in Mississippi is that Po' Monkeys was always grounded by a local group that were there all the time, with one exception. When it was rented out, the locals did not come. When there was live music, the locals did not come. So you would go to Po' Monkeys if you happened to go during one of those instances, and you might think you were having a really authentic experience, but you weren't, because the locals were not there. That was always a vital and often subtle standpoint. So I wanted there to be some tension in the photographs, and I began to photograph them a little bit this way. This is Willie and his brother James on the right, and his brother Teddy on the left, or Teddy to Willie's right, my left, and James to Willie's left. James lives in Chicago. Teddy passed away about a year after Willie did. And so I didn't instruct anyone. I put a sign up that said free portraits. I would make a portrait. I would make prints. I would have conversations. I would get contact information. I would bring prints back. I would mail prints. I would make sure that everyone had photographs from this, and then I would allow them, I would say, just stand in front of the white backdrop and do whatever you want. And then I would also allow the activity out beside it to happen. And so there started to be this tension of these worlds that I felt like was important. And there began to be juxtapositions, such as this photograph and this photograph. In this one, I really loved the body language. This gentleman that's in front of the white backdrop is German, and so he was down doing his blues pilgrimage, and his body position relative to Willie's body position, I found really interesting when I was editing these. That's my friend Ben on the right, who's an outstanding filmmaker, and a friend of his who's a sound designer. And so they helped shoot some of the video that we did out here. Couples who were having their first baby would come out. This gentleman here, that's another example of the position of just Willie's body position relative to the visitors that would come. This gentleman here with Willie is a postmaster in Richmond, Virginia, or was. I'm not sure if he's retired yet or not. Hopefully he's watching on Facebook. And he told me about, he would come down here every year. He would start taking his vacation. He would get, I think, 2 weeks of vacation. He'd come down to Mississippi, use it all at once. He was a big fan of Dan Brown over in Oxford, and then eventually, through going to visit Dan and his family, he would make his way over to the Delta. And that would be every year, writing and blues, writing and blues, writing and blues. And then sometimes the subjects would come back and get their photographs made multiple times. That's Larry. J.R. Blue, who was a musician based out of the Delta, very popular with soul blues. You can see the tree there, the trees and the power lines. I wanted so badly to Photoshop them out, but I couldn't do it. And so what I began to realize, and it became very clear to me after Willie's death, that this was as much about our future as it was about our past, that really great documentary work, to me, is not about telling you how something was. It's about presenting information so we will ask better questions, so that we will make better decisions based on better questions about our past. On July 14th, 2016, Willie passed away. He was found lying peacefully on his bed on a Thursday night. That's how he'd missed work for a couple of days. His niece came to open the club on Thursday. It was locked. She couldn't get in. She called Willie's cell phone. He didn't answer. She began to worry. She called Park. Park knew right away that something was amiss, called the sheriff's department. And when they kicked the door in, they found Willie on his bed, passed away. He'd been there for a couple of days. And so that night, it was storming. There were still some visitors that showed up. I found out about it relatively early. Raced out there, sat in my car in the rain, made some of these photographs, really struggled with whether or not I should be making photographs or not, and how, and what they should look like. There were a number from that night that I will likely never show anyone. But this is one that gives you an example of what it was like the night that Willie passed away. Red lights were everywhere. a few of the locals showed up, a few people, tourists coming, showed up. They quickly realized that something was wrong and left. And after about 2.5 or 3 hours, they had taken Willie away, and a handful of us stayed out there, and we visited and boarded the house up. That's Park Hyder there with Teddy, Willie's brother, behind him. And we got it boarded up, and finally around midnight, we all left and went back home. That was the last time we were out there together. And after that, every week, there began to be parties across the Delta on Thursday nights at various clubs that are not attended by tourists. Skybox in Shelby, Annie Bell's in Clarksdale, Old Time Blues Place, Blues Club, Blues Place, depending on who you talk to, in Marks. And I'm asked a lot by people if there are safe places to go, like Po' Monkeys. And that always makes me bristle a bit. Of course there are safe places to go. And there probably are some places that aren't as safe, just like any place in the world. I have my suspicions of what that safe means, and I'll leave it to all of you to analyze what you think that means as well. But there are plenty of other clubs throughout the Delta that play the same music, have the same local patronage, but do not get the tourism that Po' Monkeys got, or that Red's Lounge in Clarksdale gets. Why? That leads to the question of developing an economy around cultural tourism. Who does it benefit? Whose culture is being shared, and who's benefiting in the economic benefits of that? Those are the two questions, in my opinion, that we as a state need to continue to ask in deeper and deeper and deeper ways as we continue down this path of building an economy around the history of Mississippi, the cultural history of Mississippi. Who is benefiting? And furthermore, who's creating this work anymore? What happens when Red is gone in Clarksdale? Willie's gone now. B.B. King's gone. John Lee Hooker's gone. Muddy Waters is gone. All of these great artists that we are building an economy on are gone. What's coming up behind them? Does it have to be blues? Can it be something else? Should it be something else? Is it the blues, or is it just creativity that the world is attracted to in Mississippi? The fact that we had an environment down here where people needed to create for whatever reason, out of necessity, out of pragmatism, the need to escape. There was a magical creation that happened in Mississippi. And what's important to remember are all of the circumstances that forced that creation to happen. Willie lived in a sharecropper's shack. He lived in a sharecropper's shack. He made it a magical place, but let's not forget why those shacks existed in the first place. And so if we are to preserve it, it's important, as I mentioned earlier, that we also pay attention to the people that gave life to it, and their lives and their stories, and what it was that caused them to make the decisions that they had to make. And so this was Po' Monkeys not long after the auction. This is Po' Monkeys as of yesterday. The blues signs that we've got such a great trail. They're all over the world, actually. And they have done a great job of giving visitors to our state something to follow as they make their way through the Delta primarily, but it also stretches in all parts of the state. but the backs of them now are starting to fade. That's what the back of the sign looks like there. And so I would say that, I'll read my closing passage, and then there's a couple of other things that I want to say. I think we're doing okay on time, Tony? Okay. Okay. Let's see. So I'll start. So Willie worked for the Hyder family all the way up until his death, his whole life. He worked on their farm. As I mentioned earlier, they were very close. They were like family. They had a relationship that was like family, that is this southern entanglement of racial identity and sometimes healthy and sometimes unhealthy interdependency that we have on each other that is extremely complex, and it goes back for generations and generations and generations. And I'm not sitting here saying that I have any solution of how that can be solved, only a recognition that it runs deep and it's very real in the way that we interact in the South. And that in order to fix it, if it can be fixed, the first thing is just recognizing where it comes from and how it exists and how complex all of that is. And so what wound up happening is when Willie was alive, he had a living trust. He could live in the house. It was his for as long as he was alive. When he passed away, it went back to the Hyder farm, to the family. And so the structure and the land belonged to the Hyders again. The name, the intellectual property, belongs to the estate, which is Eula May and several children. And the estate decided to auction off Willie's belongings, many of them, not all of them. And they were bought by a woman who is from the Midwest that lived in Clarksdale for a while, loved Willie as well. And so she bought the belongings, which included the signs that are now missing from the front of the place. So if there were some idea of preservation that were to happen here, you have three different things, three different entities that would need to come together if your idea of preservation is that it goes back to what it was before he passed away. You've got the Hyder family, you've got the estate, and you've got the belongings that are sitting in storage, to my understanding, still in storage in Clarksdale. All three have to come together to work in order for that to happen. And so that's where this begins. As of this writing, the Hyders are doing their best to decide how to proceed. They never asked to be in this position. They never set out to be responsible for decisions of such cultural magnitude. All they ever wanted was for Willie to be happy. Yet here they are, with what seems to be the entirety of the world watching to see their decisions. And this is because most of the world sees preservation as this structure being preserved, not as much Willie's life. Criticism abounds. There's no right answer. I know this, though. Not a person involved wants anything less than to honor Willie Seabury. But what does that mean, to honor? What does it mean to preserve? Who gets to decide? Who will pay for it? Should the Hyders foot the bill? The government? The Seabury estate? What will it take to secure a fragile building exposed on three sides to the harshness of unforgiving Mississippi Delta weather? What is the story that we will tell future generations, unlucky to have not experienced what happened each week in this space? Will we tell them about a great party? Will we tell them about sharecropping? Will we tell them about that part of Mississippi's history that occurred so that this would be a space that we now celebrate? I have no answers. Each time I think I do, the logic falls apart. I can envision a scenario wherein the club is reopened and the Thursday night party continues. I can see it turned into a museum. I find myself comforted sometimes by thoughts of life and death. The reality is that we all have but a moment on this earth. When we are gone, our memories remain, and if we lived well, those memories can be as comforting and joyous as the days they were created. Willie Seabury lived well. I'm lucky to have met him as are many others across this planet. He was one of my greatest teachers, and I'm grateful for the moments we shared. I've written and rewritten this essay many times over the past few years. This book was originally scheduled to be published in 2013, but as the deadline neared, I felt that same sense of incompletion I did when the first magazine story appeared. I had a bunch of photos from a juke joint. I still didn't know what they meant. It turns out that if you try too hard to chase meaningfulness, you never really get there. That's because you're chasing a thing, importance, rather than the thing that makes the thing, authentic process. You just have to be patient and stay at it. Commit to the process, trust it, enjoy it, and worry about nothing other than that. Do this diligently enough, and importance will find you. That's what Willie C. Berry taught me. I hope this book honors him appropriately. And so I'll close with this. I get a lot of messages from people asking about Po Monkeys and its preservation, which sometimes is uncomfortable for me because it's not my job to preserve it. I hope that I help raise questions, better questions, so when we consider what it means to preserve Po Monkeys, that we will do it in a way that builds on other lessons that we've learned, that we add some newness to how we interpret this space. But not a person that I have encountered, whether they are a blues lover or not, has said that it shouldn't be preserved. Not a person. I hear over and over again from people how important it is that we preserve that space. And yesterday, as I was riding around the Delta, I came across this space. And it reminded me that why is it that we are so adamant and universal in preserving Po Monkeys, but we can't seem to preserve this space? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Will.
Thank you.
One of the comments that we had, and I know you addressed this, but just some people joined us later on. Can you remind us how Will got the Seabury got the name Po Monkey?
Po Monkey. So the monkey comes from family nicknames. His father and brothers all had family nicknames, and so that was something that their family would pass down to each other. The Po was, Willie never admitted this publicly, but I'm bringing together my own reasoning based on conversations with him, putting random pieces together and also just observing and making some assumptions. The Po was him. It was his, I don't think it was a conscious thing. Willie had an innate ability to be self-deprecating in a way that also made him more approachable. And he knew that that would make him more approachable. And if it made him more approachable, he would, you would want to come to his club and you would want to spend money. And make no mistake about it, Willie enjoyed having a good time. And he was proud of being Willie, and he was, and he enjoyed having people knew who he was, but he also liked making money. And he knew how to make you feel good, and he knew that if he could make you feel good, that you'd spend money. And so the Po became kind of a marketing thing on his part that would ultimately make him more approachable. So that's where that comes from. Came from Willie, is my best guess.
And you've sort of suggested that, part of the reason that Po Monkeys is so famous is because so many people took photographs of it. And those photographs went all around the world. And perhaps even more so that some of the very famous photographers. You mentioned Henri Cartier-Bresson took a picture of it. Is that?
Well, Bresson did make some work in the Delta. I don't know that I don't think he ever
Maybe
photographed Po monkeys, but he photographed. Now I showed some Walker Evans photographs. That was not Po monkeys that was in the
Right.
Walker Evans photograph, but it was a tenant house, and so Bresson did make some trips to the Delta. He was friends with Faulkner. And so they would make their way over. I can only imagine Faulkner and Bresson making their way to the Delta, drinking whiskey the whole way and wandering about. And so he did make some photographs. There were a number of WPA and FSA photographers that made their way through the Delta and photographed similar areas. Po monkeys itself was photographed, of course, by Annie Leibovitz. I mean, I could drop names of people that I ran into that were out there. I really don't want to do that here, but if anybody wants to contact me off, I'll tell you some of those stories. But yeah, it was a very popular place, and that became part of my desire to focus on a singular place. There are a number of projects that kind of look at the blues as a whole. Leibovitz's book of American music is one of them, and so it was a very conscious, creative decision. And I said, well, what will happen if I just focus on one place? Where will the work go if I just get to the point where I keep photographing in the same room every single week? And that was very much by design, to keep it hyper-focused.
So do you think there's a good move afoot to preserve this one way or the other? Since Po monkeys is so emblematic of the juke joint, are we going to find a way to preserve it? Do you think?
I think it depends on how you define good and how you define way. I think that a lot of my thesis work, my graduate studies work, was around our conditioned interaction with photography and how it's traced back to actually some of the same roots that are problematic with the founding of this country. And but there are elements such as archives that are very dependent on photographs that are grounded in ways that we kind of accept as a greater good, but they're still embedded with some of the same systematic problems that leak into other parts of our country. And so if we're talking about preserving Po monkeys in a way of having the structure turned into a museum of some sort, which is kind of the common route, I'm not as optimistic that that's what will happen. If we're talking about having Po monkeys serve as a baseboard for a greater understanding of how this beautiful art form was born out of this tragic environment, and making sure that we don't lose the importance of understanding that foundation of the elements that were at work that caused blues to even be created in the first place, that they're vital to it, that remains a part of the story, and it doesn't just become entertainment where we all feel great. And I'm not suggesting that we should all be down every time we engage with the blues either, but we have to be real careful that it doesn't become something that becomes so much fun that we lose where that came from. And anytime you're engaging with culture, it's important for that balance, because every creation is a reflection of its times. And if we're to really understand culture and interpret culture, we also have to understand the elements of those times. So if Po monkeys becomes a base point for that in some way, yes, I am optimistic that will happen. There are examples like the Tenement House Museum in New York that perhaps could be a part of this, but ultimately it all falls into money. It's all money. Who's going to pay for it? And then once you get into that equation, then you start to have just as problematic a thing of who gets to be at the table and decide what the interpretation is going to be. And that's also problematic. Every single thing that we know about anything that ever happened before is told through the lens of someone that had the privilege of being able to tell you this is what happened. And we're seeing a lot of backlash against that in America right now. So I'm hopeful that Poe monkeys can be a new way of interpreting and preservation. What that means, I'm not quite sure, but I also don't think it's all my answer to solve. I think there are a whole lot of people that are more invested, that should be brought to the table to help make that decision. And it should be people that typically are not involved in the idea of curation and historic preservation.
And I, just one final question, unless you have something, Stacy. Okay, one final question is, per capita, the Delta probably has more artists, musicians, writers than anywhere else.
We like to
even
claim
in the
that.
world.
We like to claim that, and I will be more than happy to perpetuate that.
Yeah.
And and have the
Well,
world.
there's kind of the theory or the running joke. Something in the water, something in the soil.
Yeah.
From your perspective as a photographer and as somebody who knows, lots of the other artists from the area, have been involved with that for years and years, your whole life. What's your theory? Why do you think the Delta is such a special place?
I had some friends were just down from Maine, just left this morning actually, and we spent the last 4 or 5 days kind of wandering around the Delta. They'd never been this far south. They were on their way out to Vegas. Raised in Southern California, spent some time in Maine, which is where I went to graduate school, purposefully to get out of the South and get some perspective of all of these things from people that did not have the same experience living here as I did. And one of the questions that they asked yesterday as we were riding around looking at various sites is if I thought that the people that live there recognized the same weight that they felt when they came in. And so I think that it's that there's a weight in the Delta, and there are some practical things that I'll get to in a minute too, but I think there's just a weight of that conflict that's there. And if you're a sensitive person, and I don't mean sensitive in the means of like, oh, you're a really great person because you care about other things, but you're like hypersensitive to, not to sound too artsy-fartsy, but like the energy that's kind of around, you can't help but be impacted by it. And so my response to them was that, yes, I think people recognize the weight, but I don't think they're as conscious of it because we kind of grow up into it. But you can't come to the Delta and not be visibly reminded every single day that someone lives dramatically differently than you do. And I think there are pockets in this country, there are a lot of them in this country, where you can disappear into the world. And so this idea of difference is more theoretical. And in the Delta, you are slammed with it every single day that someone is not like you and they live very differently from you. And that can't help but, that contrast can't help but weigh on you. The fields go from this beautiful green and gold, and a week later, it's brown and gray and burning. Like there's no buffer. There's no middle class, basically, in the Delta. People are either really wealthy or they're not. And there's very little in between. And so you've got these two extremes that are constantly butting up against each other. And so I think that is something that people, that happens there. And then from a pragmatic standpoint, you've got this dynamic born of the agricultural economy and the fact that the land, you drive across the Delta and see all of these fields spread out. And then remember, all of that acreage, 180 miles north and south, 70 or 80 miles east and west, was once swampland. And it was cleared by enslaved people. All of that open land. And there was a lot of wealth that was built from that. And so on one hand, you've got a class of people, which I'm very fortunate to be a part of, that have the means to take the time to consider what all of this weightiness is. And then on the other hand, you've got a population that needed expression in order to keep going. And those are two extremes that exist in the Delta in ways that they don't often exist. And so anywhere that you start to have extremes, I think you're going to see a rich artistic population, either because people are fortunate enough to have the time to spend on its consideration, or they have no other choice but to find some way to express themselves. And so that's what I think you get in the Delta.
Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And as noted, this will be up on our website, so those who could not join us directly will have an opportunity to watch it from the comfort of their own homes or wherever it is that they would choose to watch it. So thank you very much,
Thank you.
Will.
I appreciate it. Thank all of you out there in Facebook land. Thank you.